This video is based on a fictionalized interpretation of real-life events, but the story is inspired by actual occurrences, names, locations, and certain details have been altered. Prompted for storytelling or privacy purposes, the events depicted are not intended to be an exact representation, but rather a dramatized account meant for entertainment, education, and conservation purposes. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome, my dear. It seemed we've stumbled upon a right grisly tale. We're going back to the dirty streets of Victorian London's East End. Grab your umbrellas and button up your boots. We'll be on our way, and this time it is not an old worn-out Ripper story. Not this time. This is the tale of the Thames Torso Mysteries. Member of Parliament John Burns once said, "The St. Lawrence is water, the Mississippi is muddy water, but the Thames is liquid history." Grab a shovel and let's dig up a little bit more of that history. On September 5th, 1873, the Thames River Patrol stumbled upon a horrifying fragment. A woman's torso was found near Battersea. Now, this macabre find was just a small portion of what would work out to be a larger tragedy, what would become known as the Thames Torso Mysteries. Over the ensuing month, further remains, all belonging to the same unfortunate soul, surfaced on the muddy banks. Investigators remarked that the deceased was approximately 40 years old, had dark cropped hair, and bore a disfiguring burn mark on her left breast. A brutal blow to the head is what had extinguished her candle. The meticulous, almost surgical severance of her body parts suggested a perpetrator with some expertise, while the savage mutilation of her face spoke to profound depravity. Now, this was enough to make the most hardened cop toss his cookies. The initial discovery launched an investigation, but not much came of it because there's nothing to go by, until a pattern emerged, and then still not much. There just weren't many clues. Someone was haunting the English waterway officially from 1887 to 1889, but I'm going to tell y'all, and maybe you'll agree, but this started long before and continued long after. He claimed the lives of several women, and all but one was ever identified. Their identities were lost with their lives. The sensationalist newspapers, you're thinking gossip rags here, were spinning yarns to make sales. Speculation was rampant, fanning fires of fear. And we're just getting started. But, of course, the tabloids of that time were having a field day. The headlines were "High Rip Gang," they cried, twisting tales of terror. A criminal organization was extorting money from street workers and small businesses. And, oh, the drama. The public must have been shaking in their shoes, imagining a web of underground crime spreading across the city. But I wonder if there was any truth to it, because I didn't find anything. I think they were just looking for a hook to hang that hat on. The discovery of another dismembered female body in the Thames at Putney in June 1874 consumed the authorities' attention, but not for long. A serial killer was stalking the river, but they never got the press of the Ripper. Jackie was a rock star. And it's a thousand wonders that anyone ever left the house. I wouldn't have set foot out the house unless the house was on fire. But those choices weren't available to folks back then. Times were hard and jobs were scarce. The tattle rag of the time, News of the World, in June 14th issue, reported that the headless and limbless, except for one leg, torso was conveyed to Fulham Union Workhouse. Dr. E.C. Barnes was the surgeon and stated that the body had been divided at the spinal column and had been decomposed in lime before being dumped in the Thames. Our Dr. Barnes was living a nightmare, because if things already weren't bad enough, the jury from the inquest returned an open verdict, as if to say, "So sorry, old chap, can't be bothered, cheerio." A year later, the Tottenham Road case began with the discovery of female human remains, a skull and a thigh bone, suggesting foul play. Well, you think? You think it's foul play, really? And concurrently, an arm was found in Bedford Square bearing a prostitute's tattoo. It was offered as a potential lead, but check this out. It was not a tattoo that labeled her as a sex worker. She was labeled as a sex worker because she had a tattoo. Now, I wonder, with all this ink, what label I would have worn. I would be a sideshow. 5 days later, a torso was found near the Fitzroy Square police station. It had been placed there during a shift change. Dude has got a pair to be proud of, because that was ballsy. Efforts of the Bobbies were, after all, directed towards the evisceration and mutilation happening in Whitechapel, while the River Killer was merely dismembering bodies. The good Dr. Bond, surgeon to Metropolitan Police's A Division, must have been tearing his hair out. Thomas Bond is considered by some to be the first offender profiler and is best known for his work on the Ripper case, but this is not Jack's story, so we shall sally forth. The medical journal The Lancet reported, contrary to the popular opinion, the body had not been hacked but dexterously cut up. The joints have been opened and the bones neatly disarticulated, even the complicated joints at the ankle and elbow. And it's only at the articulations of the hip joint and shoulder that these bones have been sawn through. Oh, my word. Each case deserves its own chapter in this long, sad story, and I wish that there was more that I could tell you about them. There could have been bodies that weren't found or weren't reported. I mean, people can have their own reasons for not getting involved. The canonical four are Raynham, Whitehall, Elizabeth Jackson, and the Pynchon Torso. I have no idea why Putney and Tottenham weren't included. Are they too far apart? Was it too far previous? I don't know. I don't want to come across as flippant toward these victims. They were people too. I feel I'm rude in referring to them by the location of their bodies, but honestly, I would respectfully use their names if I knew them. So, Londoners were eating this up with a side of chips, and who could blame them? The idea of a methodical serial killer stalking the streets was much more interesting than unproductive police work. I also don't want to be hating on the police. The East End was impoverished, overcrowded, and violent. They were probably doing the best they could with what they had to work with. Yet no clues, and only one victim was ever identified. Now let's begin our investigation of the canonical cases, which had the authorities scratching their heads like a bunch of confused koalas. The Thames Torsos, or the Embankment Mysteries, if y'all prefer, because after all, our Victorian ancestors loved three names for everything. But the details of this is going to put you off your kibble for about a week. 3 years after the Tottenham court case, in May 11th, 1887, Edward Hughes was working on a barge called a lighter as an oarsman or lighterman. A lighter is a barge used to ferry goods back and forth from markets to moored ships. He found what he thought was a canvas sack with something heavy inside floating in the water. Because the Thames was often used as a dumping ground for everything, it wasn't unusual to see all manner of things floating around. But what he actually found was a female torso. As they say, curiosity kills the cat. Now, I'm going to make a meaningless connection here. A Ripper suspect also worked as a delivery person or cartman delivering goods to and from the markets, unrelated, I'm sure, just noticing a similar trade. Our protagonist of our tale took one canonical victim in the year 1887, another in 1888, and two more in 1889, and we'll get to them now. The Raynham Enigma between May and June of 1887 is where the remains of a woman's body were found in the river near Raynham, and workers first encountered the bundle with a female torso, and then throughout May and June, various parts of the same body were found, with the exception of the head and upper chest. 1888, Whitehall mystery involved a well-nourished tall woman's dismembered body found at 3 central London locations, including the new Scotland Yard's construction site. Like I said, ballsy. A skilled dissector, using a tourniquet, removed her right arm and uterus. She possibly had a healthy heart, possessed a severe left lung pleurisy, fair skin, dark hair, was unlikely to have been a servant, wearing a high-quality satin dress, only about 3 years old, and a black petticoat. Newspaper fragments in her possession were the Echo, August 24th, and an unknown Chronicle issue. Lacking a Raynham mortuary, the torso was examined at the Phoenix Hotel, actually in a shed next to the hotel, and the inquest was handled in the hotel, and the inquest only said, found dead. They say the first signs of a serial killer emerged in May 1887 in Raynham. Wow, someone's quick on the uptake, ain't they? You think? First evidence, really? Bless their little hearts. The public fascination waned quickly, as it did in these cases, and by June 1889, a 7-month lull had raised hopes that the killings were over. Or what do you think? Maybe that was just a 6 months jail term. And the guy was back. The respite was short-lived, and the findings of the torsos began again. On June 4th, 1889, a female torso was again found in the water, and more body parts were found the next week. This must have been a slow news day for the Times, or maybe they didn't sell a lot of ad space that week, because they got real in-depth about this one. The Times reported on 11 June that the remains found so far are as follows. Tuesday, left leg and thigh off Battersea. Lower part of abdomen at Horsley Down. Thursday, the liver near 9 Elms. Upper part of the body at Battersea Park. Neck and shoulders off Battersea. Friday, right foot and leg found at Wandsworth. Left leg and foot at Limehouse. Saturday, left arm and hand at Bankside. Buttocks and pelvis off Battersea. Right thigh at Chelsea Embankment. Yesterday, right arm and hand at Bankside. Creepy side note, one body part was deliberately tossed into the Shelley estate. That's the Shelley you're thinking of. The Mary Shelley that wrote Frankenstein? Yeah, body parts thrown in her yard. That gave me goosebumps. The doctors were also, this time, unable to establish a cause of death. The jury at the inquest, however, reached a decision of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Or maybe she just fell down the stairs and her body fell apart, but I do understand what they mean. They needed to know if she had passed before she was disassembled. Solely Elizabeth Jackson's identity could ever be made. Her mother, sisters, and a circle of close friends identified what was left of her body. What a cruel, cruel day. They knew her by a birthmark on her thigh and only her brother had reservations. Or maybe he just didn't want to accept that his sister had passed, especially not like that. Maybe he loved his sister, and he just didn't want to accept it. Despite the gruesome absence of her head, the deceased was identified to their satisfaction. And this is going to break your heart. A vulnerable, expectant mother, 8 months pregnant, who tragically lived on the streets of Chelsea, eking out a living of a prostitute. The investigation concluded that medical knowledge had been necessary to perform the dismemberment. At the inquest held by Dr. Braxton Hicks on June 17th, it was stated, the division of the parts showed skill and design, not, however, the anatomical skill of a surgeon, but the practical knowledge of butcher or knacker. Now, I had to look it up. In Victorian times, a knacker referred to someone who slaughtered and rendered worn-out livestock, especially horses, for products like glue, tallow, and animal feed. Often operating in a knacker's yard. I couldn't do it, y'all. I couldn't do it. They would all become pets. My house and yard would be very crowded, and I wouldn't care. We'd all be happy and alive. So, by the by, this is the same Braxton Hicks that described uterine contractions not resulting in childbirth, now known as Braxton Hicks contractions. Mr. Hicks had been called in due to his expertise in obstetrics. Discoveries commenced on September 11, 1888, when fragmented remains of a woman cropped up along the riverbank. A sequel unfolded October 7th. Now, lean in because this is weird. Laborers constructing the new Metropolitan Police headquarters stumbled upon a package. It was a black cloth containing, you guessed it, a woman's torso. This parcel had been hidden in the basement vault sometime after the last day a worker had been in the basement, and a journalist, reporter Jasper Waring, used his dog and conducted a search near the crime scene, and you know they found something because a good dog always will. It was a severed left leg, shallowly buried, and it was amputated just above the knee. The irony isn't lost on me. New Scotland Yard's building rose from the very earth that contained murder victim. The next discovery was on Pension Street. A woman's body dismembered, and the New York Herald on September 11th, 1889, blared the news, proclaiming it the mystery of mysteries. The paper sensationalized and declared that Jack the Ripper, in a spectacle of unparalleled brutality, had claimed his 9th victim, surpassing the horrors of all his previous atrocities. Well, this bold attribution holds no verity, but it was guaranteed to sell a few bundles of papers. On the same day, Metropolitan Police Commissioner James Monroe forwarded a 7-page report to the Home Office, finding the trunk of a female, minus head and legs, in one of the railway arches in Pension Street. Monroe went on to explain, the street is closed to Burner Street, which was the scene of one of the previous Whitechapel events, and that would be that of Elizabeth Stride. It is not a very narrow street, but is lonely at night and patrolled every half hour by the constable on beat. The arch where the body was found abuts into the pavement. That means it opens up onto the street. The constable discovered the body somewhat after 20 minutes after 5 in the morning of Tuesday the 10th. He is positive that when he passed this spot at about 5, there was no body there. It may be assumed that the body was placed there where it was found sometime between 5 and 5:30 a.m. Now, his timing may be off by a few minutes, but without smartphones, we can forgive a few minutes. Although the body was placed in the arch on Tuesday morning, the murder, and although there is not yet any proof of the cause of death, I assume that it was a murder, not committed there or then. There was almost no blood in the arch, and the state of the body itself showed that the death took place about 36 hours or more previously. This enables me to say that the woman was made away with, probably on Sunday night, on the 8th. This was the date on which one of the previous Whitechapel murders, that would be that of Annie Chapman, was committed. Our Mr. Monroe was using his giant brain. Had the Ripper changed his modus operandi? Well, we don't think so, because now we know that they just don't change that much. But since the remains were found so close to a previous site, and the killing itself had possibly taken place on the anniversary of a previous attack, the police, just putting two and two together, had to entertain the possibility that the Ripper had returned. Within hours of the remains being discovered, Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson was at pains to point out that the killer's modus operandi bore little resemblance to the Whitechapel murders. He said, and I'm generalizing in his statement, what becomes most apparent, and I generalize, like I said, I generalize his statement, is the absence of attack upon the lady bits, as in the series of the Whitechapel deaths beginning at Bucks Row and ending in Miller's Court. Certainly if it be the same perpetrator, there was time enough for the doer to cut off the head and limbs, and there was time to mutilate, as in the series mentioned. Despite lurid headlines suggesting that the Ripper had returned in a Herald article under a section headline, "A Different Method of Mutilation," went on to state, "A perusal of the circumstances of former atrocities of this nature only serves to confuse the reader's mind of the possible origin of this last crime. It differs from the Whitechapel series in the facts that the head and lower limbs were amputated, and in the other fact that the hands were left undisturbed, but it resembles them in infliction of a deep longitudinal cut over the lower half of the trunk." Smart reporting from the Herald. I'm proud of you. What Chief Commissioner Monroe thought. Now, this James Monroe is not the same James Monroe that was our 5th president, but he entered a detailed comparison of this murder with the previous Whitechapel events and observed that if this a fresh outrage by the Whitechapel murderer known by the horribly familiar name of Jack the Ripper, this was committed in the assassin's house and would be a new departure from the system hitherto pursued by this ruffian. I am, however, inclined to believe that this was not the case of the Ripper. Monroe went on to say that in previous cases, death had been caused by cutting the throat, where in the case of the Pension Street victim, there was nothing to show that her death had come about in that way. Where the previous cases, the bodies had been mutilated, in this latest case, there is no mutilation other than dismemberment. Well, there we have that. Previous victims had suffered evisceration, but the Pension Street victim most certainly had not. Several of the previous cases, there had been removal of certain body parts, where the Pension Street victim, there was no removal of any portion of the organs of generation or intestines. Concerning the location, the previous murders, Monroe continued to point out, they had all been committed in the street, except for one instance in Dorset Street, a reference to Mary Kelly, when there were distinct traces of furious mania the murderer, having plenty of time at his disposal, slashed and cut the body in all directions, eventually under the influence of a frenzy. Conceding that, in respect to the indoor murder of Mary Kelly, the killing of the Pinchin Street victim had also been committed indoors, probably in a lodging. Monroe went on to stress in the latter case, there is no sign of frenzied mutilation of the body, but of deliberate and skillful dismemberment with a view to removal. A creepy side note, it was rumored that the organs were in place in the torso until they used a cart to move the body and the organs came out. Monroe continued to point out, I am inclined to the belief, taking one thing with another, this is not the work of the Whitechapel criminal. Today, experts are inclined to agree with Monroe's assessment that the Pinchin Street murder was not carried out by JTR, but that it may well have been linked to another series of crimes that included the Whitehall mystery. And didn't you and I already think of that? The victim's identity, like that of the perpetrator, remained unknown. Coroner Wynne Baxter confirmed a violent death at the inquest, noting no connection to other local murderers. He's a jerk. The unidentified woman was buried October 5th in East London Cemetery in Essex, and her plaque says, this case contains the body of a woman unknown, found in Pinchin Street, St. George in the East, 10 September 89. Now, we hear nothing again from them until 1902, taking his last victim south of the Thames and leaving her body in a pile of dismembered parts. So this time, the parts were just left in a pile and there was no time to distribute them elsewhere. So there had been a 10-year break. Or what do y'all think? Maybe that was the term of a jail sentence? And then whoever this was returned and got back to their work, and no one was ever caught, although there was someone who did a little time around it. A lot of individuals, their professions were seemingly tangential to the torso killer's profile. Nonetheless, they emerged as potential suspects. Among them were several connected to the butchery trade, cattle herders, slaughterhouse employees, and butchers. The investigation ensnared a diverse group of rivermen, shopwrights, and along with the witnesses, primarily the builders and carpenters who had discovered the remains at the building site. The investigation widened to include factory workers, metal workers, distilleries, oil production, paint production, transient laborers, artisans, and even some stonemasons. But here's a key suspect. Well, two of them actually. John and Samuel Faircloth. Now, John was the baby daddy, most likely, of Elizabeth Jackson's child. He was violent. There was a lot of stuff that pointed his way. Other suspects included medical professionals and a ex-soldier that worked as a groom at a nearby stable. But this one floated to the top, pun intended. James Crick, a Thames bargeman, and he was the prime suspect in this case, had a job that ferried passengers and cargo. Well, his violent nature was first hinted at by domestic assault charges that escalated to attempted murder and 2 SA convictions, earning him 15 years of hard labor in the Old Bailey. And guess what? After his conviction, the murder stopped. His guilt, he's guilty of some stuff, and he's certainly guilty of being a jerk, But the Metropolitan Police didn't have enough evidence to hang anything else on him. Miss Jessie Miller's misplaced trust in Crick cost her dearly. His offer of going out to watch the Shah of Persia's arrival on his royal yacht ended with her brutal assault and a near fatal attempt at disposing her body in the Thames. Lack of evidence got this thrown out of court. But another woman, Elizabeth Warburton, accusations secured Crick's conviction and added that evidence is what got him his 15-year sentence. And although he was in prison, the question persisted, did he actually do it? But there was no evidence to carry it out. Did he escape murder charges just to be convicted of a lesser crime? The methods resembled the Torso killer's, his trying to do stuff to the girls and then throw them in the river. So over a century later, Crick does remain the prime suspect. His access to the river and victim disposal sites is the most damning evidence. On June in 1902, a woman's torso was found in Salamanca Alley in Lambeth, the area of London. No suspect was identified in her case either. But Crick was in the slammer, right? Kind of makes me curious. And let me just close by saying, we don't know if the Thames Torso murderer killed prostitutes. The majority of the victims have never been identified. So we don't know what they may have done for a living. We don't even know if they lived in Whitechapel or the surrounding area. Many women in Whitechapel were prostitutes and many were not. It's just as possible they were charwomen, factory workers, and shop girls, wives and mothers. While Elizabeth Jackson was a sex worker, we can't conclude based on that all the others were too. Likewise, we have no idea of the age of most of these victims. We don't know if they were, we know that they weren't children or elderly, but that's about it. Sweet dreams, my loves. I'll see you next week.